Not only do they fear for their lives, but people in Ukraine are also experiencing food shortages. According to the Ukrainian government, the Russian blockade of its ports has caused 22 million tons of grain to become stranded in the nation, and this is a country that feeds the world. In this video, we'll tell you about the female farmers in Ukraine fighting to prevent hunger around the globe. Starting off with the role of Ukrainian farmers during the war. Ukraine and Russia play a significant role in the sale and production of agricultural products, so the conflict is also having a huge effect on international supply chains. A growing worldwide food crisis has been made worse by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has stalled Ukraine's ports for months. The impacts of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine have been felt all around the world since it began in February. Millions of people were paying more for basic supplies even before the conflict as a result of the climate catastrophe and COVID-19-related supply chain concerns. According to the World Food Program, the number of people who are food insecure worldwide has doubled to 276 million. The United Nations said in June that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia had caused an additional 71 million people to fall into poverty, most of them in nations in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, raising concerns about civil unrest and the start of new famines. In Ukraine, women have traditionally had a significant impact on agriculture. They've played a significant role in managing livestock and cultivating the land in the country's fertile south, which is frequently referred to as the breadbasket of Europe. They'd just become dominant figures in agriculture in the 3 decades since the Soviet Union's fall, and are rising once again to play their part during the war. Next, let's look at the devastation these farmers are facing. Ivanova and Petrovskaya are 2 of the approximately 10,000 women in Ukraine who've taken over their family's farms. Farming these days feels like a race against time to Ivanova and her 24-year-old daughter Anastasia, who also works for the family business. As the Russians attempt to gain additional ground, the nature of the fight is constantly changing. These farmers are currently trying to feed their people and market their harvests internationally. Together, the mother and daughter are a force of nature. Many Ukrainian soldiers arrived on their farm during the tumultuous first few weeks of the conflict in search of a place to rest, some with injuries needing urgent care. The mother-daughter duo not only took them all in, they also fed and looked after the soldiers for weeks. But sadly, their farm was attacked in March. After preparing the fields for the summer harvest, Ivanova and her employees were asleep when they heard the whistling of missiles and the blasts of cluster bombs startled them up. Each of their 45 fields had missiles in them. Tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment was destroyed, and a 3-story sorter building full of grain was torn apart. Some of her tractor's engines and windshields were shattered in the hangar where they were kept. Coming up, these farmers are still hoping against hope. No one should be surprised that many Ukrainian farmers haven't even been able to finish harvesting their crops this year due to violence at their doorsteps and damaged equipment. Even if they manage to harvest, they're unable to transport their produce. Russian forces continue to pelt agricultural areas with missiles and bullets, destroying infrastructure, equipment, and cattle while leaving nothing but a trail of destruction. Attacks have also killed women working on these farmlands. While the women risk their lives at the farm, the men of their families are on the front lines, also risking their lives for their country. These women know that their harvests will most likely go to waste, as the window to export them to the international market is very tight, but they keep fighting to feed the world. Now, we take a look at the dire effects of this felt all over the world. Fighting in Kharkiv, Ukraine's northeastern city, has partially destroyed the country's main seed bank, which has around 2,000 crop samples in underground vaults. Ukraine's future is in jeopardy if its farmers are unable to cultivate their land and the nation's seed banks are destroyed. Now, we must consider rehabilitation even when war is at hand. It's incredibly challenging to recreate a food chain without seeds. This was a nation that regularly sent ships packed with wheat, sunflower oil, and corn to the Middle East and North Africa to feed 10 times its own population. Egypt, Lebanon, and Mauritania are just a few of the nations that have come to rely on Ukraine's massive exports, which have slowed to a trickle as Russia blocks its Black Sea ports. As Ukrainian farmers continue their postponed spring sowing cycle, the extent of the harm Russia has done to that nation's ability to produce food is destabilizing global markets. Food prices have skyrocketed, creating a previously unheard of affordability catastrophe that'll increase the already record high level of hunger in the world. Russia knows that Ukraine has some of the world's richest agricultural land, so their intentional targeting of farms is all the more terrible. A third of Ukraine's total agriculture has been rendered unusable due to Russian military occupation, landmines, unexploded bombs, and the scorched remains of military equipment like tanks. This will trigger devastating food shortages around the globe. Next, we look at some of the steps being taken to counter the damage. After the war started, Ukraine's farmers struggled to get access to essential supplies like fuel, fertilizer, and seeds, but they're still managing to plant crops like corn, sunflowers, and soybeans this spring. According to most estimates, about 70% of the surface area from last year can be planted. But another worry is whether they'll be able to harvest normally later in the year, as the wheat that farmers have been tending to last winter is still under threat. The EU is working to address the intricate logistical issues preventing the growth of land-based exports, but until those issues are resolved, there's a serious risk of financial catastrophe for the farmers who are still in business because they depend on the traders for their income. Even though the immediate focus has naturally been on aiding Ukrainians who are staying in and leaving the country, WFP is still looking for additional funding to sustain its mission and resolve the food crisis. Now, in other news from Ukraine. First up, the UN condemns Russia at the General Assembly. With a resounding majority, the UN General Assembly has denounced Russia's plans to invade 4 areas of Ukraine. 143 nations voted in favor of the resolution, while 35 governments, including China and India, abstained. The vote for this resolution was opposed by Belarus, North Korea, Syria, Nicaragua, and of course, Russia itself. It's actually the most votes countries have given against Russia since the invasion began. President Vladimir Putin signed legal documents last week to annex the eastern Ukrainian provinces of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson to Russia in a formal ceremony held in the Kremlin. The UN resolution aims to get Russia to back off and urges the international community to reject all of its annexation claims. Russia's use of its veto to block action at the Security Council prompted the General Assembly vote. China, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom also have veto power on the Council as permanent members. Since the war began, more and more people are urging the UN to remove Russia's veto power. Next, the US also condemned Russia's brutalities. Russia has come under heavy criticism for its attacks by the United States in particular. In addition to promising additional military assistance, the US claimed that the brutal attacks had non-military targets such as a university and a playground. Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, expressed his disappointment and shock at the nature of the attack. The explosion on a crucial bridge connecting Russia and Crimea was the given reason behind the strikes by President Vladimir Putin. According to Ukraine, 83 missiles were fired, more than half of which were intercepted, but the attack remains among the bloodiest to hit Ukraine in recent months. According to officials, at least 14 individuals were killed and many others were hurt. After missiles struck the enemy infrastructure, several areas were left without electricity and water. Residents of the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, claimed that it looked like Russia was specifically targeting civilian spaces, including a children's playground, a university, and the well-known Taras Shevchenko Park, which were crowded with commuters on Monday morning. Lastly, sirens continue to go off across Ukraine. In response to Russia's second day of retaliatory missile attacks following the explosion on a bridge connecting Crimea and Russia on Saturday, air raid sirens continue to sound across Ukraine. Just before 8 a.m., air raid alerts were issued for Kyiv, the country's capital, and other locations. Later, they were sounding throughout the country, including Lviv in the west. Most of the cities, including Kyiv, no longer have warnings in effect, but the government is advising residents to remain in shelters. That's a wrap for this video. What are your views on the developing food crisis due to this war? Let us know in the comments below. As always, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.